New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell. I'm the Director of Global Marketing here at Balchem. Today, we welcome back Dr. Lance Baumgard from Iowa State University to help us rethink immunity in transition cows. Lance, before we get started, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Southwest Nutrition Conference, which you're involved in organizing. You know, who should attend, why they should attend, and what are some of the highlights of the program?
Hey, Scott, thanks. The Southwest, I've been on the organizing committee since 2001. So it's one of those committees that you have to die to get off of, I guess. We have the 40th annual Southwest Nutrition Conference this coming January, I think 29, 30, and 31, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in Chandler, Arizona. I'm going to show you a program here in a second, but we routinely get nutritionists from all over the world, but in particular the West and Midwest and Northeast. We calculate probably around 3.5, 4 million cows represented by nutritionists who attend the meeting. So it's warm weather. It's a good meeting, great networking opportunity. So hope to see everyone there.
Yeah. Good job. Lance, I failed to give you a proper introduction, so let me do so. Dr. Lance Baumgard is a native of Southwest Minnesota, where he grew up on a swine and row crop farm. He has a BS and MS degrees from the University of Minnesota and a PhD from Cornell University. He joined the University of Arizona faculty as an assistant professor in the fall of 2001 and was promoted to associate professor in the spring of 2007. Then Dr. Baumgard joined Iowa State University in 2009 and is the Norman Jacobson Professor in the Department of Animal Science. Since 2005, Dr. Baumgard's primary research emphasis has been on the physiology and endocrine consequences of heat stress and immune activation in both ruminants and monogastric farm animals. So with that, Lance, take it away.
Well, great. Thanks for the opportunity again, Scott and Balchem. It's one of the webinar invitations that I truly do value. It's like a who's who of faculty members giving presentations. And today they asked me to talk about the immune system, transition period immune system, because we have a few publications recently on this exact topic. So, but before we do this, just a shameless plug for the Southwest Nutrition Conference. Balchem is the primary pre-conference conference sponsor. And I think we have a great lineup of speakers. And like I said, warm weather, golf, some whiskey tasting. Hope to see you in Chandler, Arizona at the end of January. Almost everything today that I'll be talking about has been based upon 4 of our recent publications. And the main student here is Julie Opgennorth. She is now a nutritionist for Purina. But the 3 papers that are going to get a lot of attention from me in this presentation are her first one here, where we gave LPS to early versus late lactating cows. We looked at the inflammatory and immune responses. Then we looked at the production and metabolism responses. And later on, then we tried to create more of a natural infection model where we gave LPS up the mammary gland. Now, all 3 of these papers were set on the foundation of this review we wrote in 2021. And the 2 co-authors on this paper are Aaron Horst and Sarah Kavidra, both former PhD students of mine who now both work at Elanco. So if you have interest in learning more of the details and specifics about everything I'm talking about today, these papers, I think, would do a great job, at least I'm a little biased, in explaining in more detail what I'm talking about. If you don't want to read, you can also get quite a bit of information on the previous webinars I've given in the Real Science Lecture Series. This is my third one now. My first one was on heat stress. The second one was on the transition cal dogma. And that one's primarily based upon that 2021 JDS review. And then I had the great fortune and pleasure of it being on a podcast with Jim Drakely and Scott, and we talked more about the webinar. So you got a variety of different options. You can go to JDS and read more about it, or watch these webinars. I think they're also quite helpful. Okay, so let's get into it now. You've seen slides or graphs like this before, where you have calving in the middle, and this is a really nice review by the Italian group. And one of the faculty members who I admire a lot and who's had a huge impact on the way I think is Murnio Trevisi. And I don't want to get bogged down in the details here, but here we have immune capacity going down prior to calving and staying down post-calving. And we have, for a long time now, going on 40 years, believed that this immune suppression is the reason why cows have an increased incidence of morbidity and mortality and culling in the early transition period. So you've seen probably dozens, if not more, figures that are demonstrating some type of immune suppression or a decrease in immune capacity during the transition period. So this immune suppression dogma is resonates throughout the global dairy industry. Okay, so the traditional immune system metabolism dogma of the transition period is that high NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and subclinical hypocalcemia are causing problems. It's not just correlated, they're causing production and health problems. So the traditional dogma kind of goes like this, where the cow calves, she becomes subclinically hypocalcemic and she has high levels of NEFAs. These NEFAs are converted 1-to-1 in the liver to ketones. We know that's not true. This causes ketosis. Importantly, these three simple metabolites and minerals are thought to reduce feed intake, which contributes to a DA. For the purposes of today's webinar, it's thought that these three contribute to or cause immune suppression. Now, once there's immune suppression, the transition cow is more susceptible to developing some type of infection or problem. They're also thought to impair fertility and ultimately a decrease in productivity and decrease in farmer profitability. Okay, so there might be some small nuances, differences between where you're at in the globe, but that's in general the transition period dogma that we've had now since probably the early 80s. Why do we think this? Because there are dozens, maybe hundreds of studies that associate and correlate these three with negative outcomes. And I've on purpose underlined the word associate and correlate on purpose. And I just listed 4 or 5 papers here, really good papers by really good scientists who I admire and respect that mathematically connect these with negative outcomes. Importantly, though, there are a variety of inconsistencies in the literature, which I think is quite important with regards to a dogma gaining a foothold, a global foothold, and how we approach the transition period. Now, this is very, very different than the overwhelming and multiple converging lines of evidence demonstrating that smoking causes cancer. I recently had a couple of veterinary colleagues claim that if you are a skeptic of NEFAs and ketones, well, this would be similar then to questioning whether smoking causes cancer. And that's just an absurd comparison. there's no comparison between these two disciplines, right? The overwhelming amount of evidence, causal and correlation, that smoking causes cancer is undoubtedly. So plasma nephas are markedly increased following calving in most cows. Why do some cows come down with ketosis, right? This is what makes some cows more susceptible to transition period issues. And I think biology is too complex to approach it with a reductionist concept where one metabolite will equal one disease. I don't think it's that simple. So here's where everyone agrees that the incidence of health problems, morbidity, is highest in the first month of lactation. That's well documented. However, the largest swings in metabolites like glucose, nephas, ketones, hormones like insulin, glucagon, epinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone, prolactin, and minerals, including calcium and zinc, iron. The largest swings in all of these occur in a very small window of time. And as a consequence, then there's a lot of moving parts that occur simultaneously. Well, mathematically, then they are likely to be correlated. And of course, we all learned in junior high science classes that causality and correlation are not the same. But if you believe that the correlation is causation, well, then that causes a farmer to make suspect decision making and maybe unnecessary farm expenses. Okay, I'll show you here what I'm talking about. This is just one figure I grabbed from the internet a few years ago about ketosis, how you have this hidden ketosis or presumably subclinical ketosis causing these problems ranging anywhere from DA to milk to fertility, culling. And so if a farmer or someone is buying into this type of model, well, of course, you're going to spend money on preventing subclinical ketosis. But if hyperketonemia and high nephas and subclinical hypocalcemia were in fact pathological, in other words, they were causing problems, well, then it just makes sense that if you therapeutically treat these, the cow health and productivity would get better. And I would say we've been aggressively treating them for at least 25, 30 years now. So we just took the time, my group and I went into the NOMS report and looks at different culling reasons on the left and different NOMS, 1996, 2002, 2014 on these columns. And what you can see here is that despite the fact that we've been aggressively treating for ketosis or hyperketonemia and subclinical hypocalcemia, I would argue that herd health is not necessarily getting much better. And so it begs the question, then maybe we're just simply medicating the wrong things, right? Like I said, you don't need to be a professor of nutritional physiology to look at this table and say, something's askew here. So then you got to step back and ask the question, why and how would nephas, hyperketonemia, and hypocalcemia cause problems? Biological plausibility is a term that's used a lot. So what would Mother Nature or evolution, what would the purpose be, right? We know almost all females mobilize adipose tissue, muscle, and bone following parturition to support lactation. What would the evolutionary advantage be then if those three processes also put her at a disadvantage or cause her to be sick? I don't think evolution would favor a system that way. So I think there remains very little evidence, mechanistic evidence, for how nephas, ketones, and calcium cause such a large, have such a large impact on seemingly very different unconnected systems and diseases. I would say the best line of evidence probably stems from its purported role in immune suppression, which is the topic of today's talk. So we know that almost all there's a huge increase in culling and morbidity in the transition period. We've seen figures like this. This is out of the University of Minnesota Vet School. You've probably seen something like this 1,000 times. Jim Drakely wrote a fantastic review now, shockingly 26 years ago, that this only about 50% of the cows get to the transition period without experiencing one of these negative health outcomes. And so the dogma is that these problems are caused by immune suppression. So I just wonder if you should go back. I wonder if it's fair, though, to throw RPs, metritis, DAs into that, because one stupid mathematical example would be the risk of dying in a plane crash is 1 out of 7.7 million flights. But obviously, if you don't fly at all, the risk would be 0. I say that because, RP, mastitis, DAs, they are essentially transition cow issues, right? You're very unlikely to get metritis or DA after the transition period. So I don't know. Using modern classification systems, I hope, at least I don't think, 50% of transition cows have some type of an adverse event. And that's especially true if you remove subclinical hypocalcemia and subclinical hyperketonemia from, an illness. Okay, so as everyone who's listening to this knows, right, your wellness or your health status is a combination of both your immune system, the competency of your immune system, and your pathogen exposure. So, right, this is a teeter-totter. If the pathogen exposure gets heavy, you're going to get sick, or if your immune system becomes compromised, you could get sick. And, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, like I was born in 72, we were probably, at least in America, you're probably very familiar with what we affectionately refer to as the bubble boy. The bubble boy was born in the early 70s. He had severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID. And of course, then he had a very weak immune system. So he essentially lived in almost a pathogen-free environment, which is this bubble. And it's not just him, of course. There are many children who were born with SCID, and this is the way they have to live. We do that to minimize pathogen exposure. My only point of bringing this up, of course, is to make sure we're all remembering that getting sick or getting an infection is a combination of both a balancing act of your immune system versus the pathogen load. So it's very important. And from a transition period, we've then are under the understanding that the reason a cow gets sick is not because of an increase in pathogen load, but because of a decrease in immune competency. Okay, so let's now turn our attention a little bit to inflammation in the transition period. I have a picture of Emilio Trevisi up here because he's just had a huge impact on the way my group thinks about the transition period. Inflammation is observed in almost all cows, transition cows. The sources of that inflammation, some obvious ones would be the mammary gland, the uterus. We think the GI tract is one. And I'm going to show you a slide soon showing you sterile inflammation. But our group has been working on what's the consequences from an energetic and protein response and mineral response to this inflammation. And this slide here was made by a former student of mine, Brady Gates. And so we know there's an inflammatory response at dry off. There's a couple smaller inflammatory responses during the dry period. And then, of course, this well-described inflammatory response at parturition. Now, there is a heightened risk of getting exposed to a pathogen in the transition period. And the most likely source is probably the mammary gland and the uterus. Okay, so and we all know that mastitis occurs at an increased rate in early lactation. There's a variety of really nice papers showing that a very large percentage of uteri are contaminated with bacteria in early lactation. And the GI tract, going from a high forage to a high concentrate diet, we think is a source. And there's also this thing called non-pathogenic, or sometimes referred to as sterile inflammation. This is important because we know that the simple act of parturition requires inflammation. Expelling the placenta requires inflammation. And involuting the uterus also is an inflammatory event. So they're both sterile and and pathogenic inflammation or infectious inflammation occurring in the transition period. This slide was made by a former student, Sarah Kavidra. Here I have three different epithelium: the gut, the mammary gland, and the uterus. And lipopolysaccharide here in red, if this lipopolysaccharide can infiltrate one of these epithelial barriers, it's immediately part of the innate immune system's LPS binding protein, or LBP, which then will chaperone the LPS to some type of immune cell for detoxification. In this example, it's a Kupffer within the liver, a resident macrophage. And in this process of detoxification, there's an inflammatory response characterized by an increase in cytokines like TNF-alpha, interleukins, and acute phase proteins, serum amyloid A, haptoglobin, and LBP. And I'm just highlighting these because I'm going to show you more data, the temporal profile of these here now in the next few slides. I really like these two really nice papers. This is actually a dissertation, but looking at haptoglobin on the y-axis. Now the assays are the reason why there's differences in actual values, but the values aren't what's important, it's the patterns. This is out of the Oregon State University, where they took blood samples throughout the transition period, and they retrospectively classified them as being healthy. So this is, they're in blue. They did not have a health event. So even the cows that did not have a health event, there's always some inflammation. Cows that died were characterized as having mild or severe disease, or an orange and green. And if the cow did not make it to 100 days in milk, either died on farm or was called before 100 days in milk, they're in purple. And you see here that if they didn't make it to 100 days in milk, you could go back almost 97 days earlier and demonstrate that they had a much larger immune or inflammatory response, and it did not resolve very quickly either. And this also then is similar to metritis. This is a great paper out of Nina Van Keyserlink's group, demonstrating that inflammation in this by haptoglobin occurs prior to clinical presentation of a disease. Okay, so one of my graduate students, Bridget Buell, made this figure. It's showing inflammation, sterile inflammation or non-pathogenic inflammation versus infectious or pathogenic inflammation. So this is our conundrum as an industry, I believe, is that I think we want to limit and try to avoid pathogenic inflammation, but the sterile inflammation is quite important. And if we interfere with that, I think there's going to be negative outcomes. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that. In fact, one of our first papers in this whole is a 2007 or 8 paper where we totally hit inflammation over the head with a sledgehammer right at calving. And there was a lot of negative outcomes, including RP and metritis. So moving forward as an industry, this is the type of inflammation that we need to consider. I think we want to limit this one, prevent it, but not interfere with normal sterile inflammation. So the immune suppression model then that's been made over the years is we have negative energy balance contributing to milk or to immune suppression, and then these immune suppression then allows there to be an increase in negative outcomes or different types of infections. So my group went, I love history, I love science, so my group went back to try to find some of the original papers on immune suppression. And so here we have a 1979 paper out of the UK showing that when a cow gets mastitis in the transition period, neutrophils or somatic cells transport into the mammary gland is called chemotaxis, is delayed. And another paper out of the UK by Lloyd, I think, is the first person to ever use the word, at least in context of dairy cows, immune suppression. You see here, he uses the economic importance of infections arising as a result of peripareuterine immune suppression. So this was the late 70s, very early 80s. And from what I could tell, Lloyd did not publish much, or actually neither group published much after these two seminal papers. But the Iowa State USDA NADC group of guys picked that up and really did a fantastic job of characterizing the transition period immunology. And I would argue almost everything we now know about the transition period immunological systems is because of these four guys. Mark Curley and Ron Horst are neighbors of mine. Ron unfortunately passed away recently, 2 or 3 years ago. Jim Roth is still at Iowa State University. And Jesse was both at the NADC and at Iowa State. And I think Mark got his PhD with Jim, and I think Jesse got his PhD with Ron. These four guys have just done a fantastic job of characterizing and studying the transition period immunology. Okay, so the thought process is that transition cows are more susceptible to disease, right? And why do we think that? Well, because ex vivo assays, a variety of them, demonstrate that there's an altered functionality of circulating immune cells. Primarily, I'm talking about neutrophils. There's a little bit of work on the adaptive immune system, but most of this is on the innate immune system. Okay, so there's a variety of ex vivo functionality assays, and what the classic approach here is where blood samples are obtained from cows prior to calving, 14, 21, 28 days before calving. You take them back to the lab and they appear highly functional. You take the same cow, you take a blood sample from the same cow shortly after calving during this 3-week window, and you do the same exact ex vivo assay, and there appears to be some type of dysfunctionality with them. And then after they get out of the transition period, 21, 28, 35, whatever, days following calving, then these functional assays return to the way they looked before calving. So there's a temporal profile that anyone would interpret as saying, hey, there's a problem with these circulating neutrophils. The question we're having is it fair? Is it fair to compare neutrophils 3 weeks before calving to the neutrophils 3 days after calving? Well, what we know now, and a lot of papers just started coming out on this exact topic in the early 2010, 12, 13, and some reviews then were written about them in around the 2015 timeframe. And so what we know now is that neutrophils continue to mature while in circulation. And so when they leave the bone marrow, they're immature and they're not ready to infiltrate into a tissue until they gain a variety of different molecular tools. One of them is called L-selectin. Well, also what we know is that inflammation causes the causes the bone marrow to secrete more immature neutrophils. So for example, we know, I've already showed you, the transition cows inflamed. Every one of them is. And there's an increased risk of pathogen exposure. So what we think is happening, well, I have a little review. I have a figure of it here. Here we have the blood system, the circulatory system, shown here in red. And the mature neutrophils are in blue. Immature ones are in green. So before calving, the cow's healthy, and so vast majority of the circulating neutrophils would be mature and functional. Okay. Now, after calving, so you take a blood sample, you go back to the lab, and they look highly functional. After calving, we have neutrophil chemotaxis into the mammary gland, into the uterus. We believe into the GI tract, and there's some recent data showing that exact thing happens during the transition period. And because now the mature ones are located or infiltrated different tissues, and there's inflammation, the bone marrow then releases more immature neutrophils. So now when you take a blood sample at 3 days or 7 days post-calving, and you bring it to the lab, the functionality looks less than what it did before calving. And I think this phenomenon is described really nicely in these very basic immunology reviews. But anyway, that's why I think the interpretation could be, hey, we have immune suppression, when really it's probably an inflammatory response causing the circulatory pool to contain more immature neutrophils. So obviously, as everyone knows, ex vivo assays have limitations, but I think this is really the case in early lactation. So the question then becomes, can we investigate the immune system in vivo in early lactation? How do you do that? How do you study transition period immune competency? It's difficult, especially from a university perspective, where most of our dairy research farms are relatively small. So oftentimes we model immune activation in the transition period using mid-lactation cows, and there's a variety of advantages to that. One is that, of course, milk yield and feed intake are essentially plateaued and more consistent. We have a broader selection pool from a research perspective. And of course, there is much less variability in the physiology, the metabolism, and the inflammatory responses. However, there's a variety of limitations using a mid-lactation cow to model transition period immunology, the immune system. Of course, the early lactation metabolic milieu is very difficult to replicate in mid-lactation cows. In fact, it's very difficult to cause ketosis in a cow that's in late lactation, even with severe feed restriction. There's different statuses, obviously, between the mid and early lactation. And a big one from a metabolism and production point of view is that the mammary glands' drive to synthesize milk wanes over time. In other words, in early lactation, you can insult her with feed restriction or LPS or whatever, and the mammary gland still has an enormous evolutionary drive, genetic drive to make milk, where in late lactation, if you feed restrict her or give her some type of insult, she just gives up making milk. So here's some models demonstrating this, utilizing mid-lactation cow. My group uses a bunch of them. It's not just me, of course. It's a variety of people all over the globe. Some very good scientists that I respect also use the mid-lactation cow. And there's been an enormous amount of advancements made using the mid-lactation cow. But there's this constant, yeah, but the mid-lactation cow is just not the same. So our group had the objective to, okay, we want to directly compare early lactation versus late lactating cows, the immune response. And actually our initial hypothesis was that the early lactating cow would be more tolerant to LPS because presumably they'd just been exposed to LPS during the parturition process, and that they would have a dampened immune response to the LPS, right? That would coincide with this immune suppression idea, that they would have a dampened inflammatory response. So the two papers I've already showed you in the very second slide, but these two papers are, if you want more details, specific details about this experiment, please look those up. We took multiparous Holstein cows in early lactation, EL. They were 20 days in milk. Mid-lactation, which they were 131 days in milk. We collected baseline data, and then we gave them an IV LPS challenge. And we also used pair feeding early lactating and pair feeding mid-lactation cows. I kind of wish we hadn't done that now just because, well, I'll show you in a minute. We gave them a very low dose of LPS, 0.09, which is fairly low. And the pair-fed controls received saline. And it was a 2x2 factorial design. So, again, early pair feeding, mid-lactation pair feeding, early lactation LPS, mid-lactation LPS. And if it gets confusing, what I'll oftentimes do is just simply remove the pair feeding because it's not relevant to much of the story. So we gave the LPS at time 0. There's a fever response in both groups of cows. But what kind of surprised us was that the early lactating cows had a much more febrile response compared to the lactating cows. 1.1 degrees centigrade difference, which was substantial. Then when we took a look at cytokines, again, this is time relative to the LPS challenge. In hours, TNF alpha, interleukin 6, and interleukin 2, these inflammatory cytokines, all increased in both lactation stages, but were much higher and stayed higher in early lactation. So just opposite of what we anticipated. The chemotactic cytokines, these are cytokines that tell the immune system, specifically the neutrophils and macrophages, you need to come to a site of infection, are increased in both lactation stages. But again, almost every single one of them are more robustly increased in early lactating cows, or it's augmented in early lactation. When we take a look at acute phase proteins, LPS binding protein, haptoglobin, and serum amyloid A, those are the two I was telling you about earlier. Again, increased in both lactation stages, but markedly increased in early lactation compared to late lactation. So the cytokines, the acute phase proteins, and the febrile response are much more exacerbated or exaggerated in early lactating cows. When you give LPS to any type of animal, there's a biphasic response to circulating leukocytes. In this particular example, I have neutrophils and monocytes. When you give IV LPS, the animal assumes that there's an infection. It's probably assuming it's in the gut. The animal gets diarrhea very, very quickly. But so all the circulating neutrophils and monocytes, actually all the leukocytes, exit circulation, and there's almost a 95% reduction in circulating neutrophils and monocytes. This reduction is similar between the two lactation stages, but the neutrophilic phase, in other words, the ability of the bone marrow to secrete neutrophils, is much more robust in early lactation, and the same thing occurs in monocytes compared to late lactation. So this biphasic response is different in the two stages, and it's more exaggerated in early lactation than it is in late lactation. Hypocalcemia is a response, a very conserved response to immune activation, and both groups of cows become subclinically hypocalcemic upon immune activation, but the early lactation cows have more of a hypocalcemic response. Okay, it's more exaggerated. So LPS cows, LPS infusion did everything we anticipated it doing, but every single marker of immune activation was more exaggerated in early lactation. Thus, our hypothesis was incredibly wrong. Most aspects of the early lactating cow was incredibly robust and much more exaggerated than in late lactation. Take a look at metabolism and productivity of these cows. Yes, LPS had a marked reduction in feed intake, right? Sick animals don't have an appetite, but surprisingly, the two were very, very similar. Actually, the early lactating cows had a much more exaggerated hypophasic response than the mid-lactation cows. So we anticipated there to be large differences in milk yield, but there wasn't. In fact, the overall milk yield between the early and mid-lactating cows was not different, except for small differences on day one. So the early lactating cow prioritizes the synthesis of milk. Kind of what I mentioned earlier, there's an evolutionary drive for her to make milk, even in the face of immune activation. How does she do that? Well, she does it via changes in homeoretic metabolic adjustments. Here we have the early lactating cow getting immune activation with LPS, and there's an increase in insulin. Sorry, this is a mid-lactation cow, has more of an insulin response. This insulin response then, of course, inhibits adipose tissue mobilization. The early lactation cow has a much more blunted insulin response compared to the mid-lactation cow. And the same thing happens in glucagon. Look at here, the early lactation cows have a much more exaggerated response in glucagon. And of course, glucagon simulates gluconeogenesis in the liver. So the two lactation stages are very different with regards to the hormonal regulation of energetic metabolism. So, and these, of course, are glucose sparing mechanisms to provide glucose for the milk. In early lactation, in mid-lactation cows, when you give them LPS, there's an immediate reduction in circulating non-acidified fatty acids. This is very different than what happens in vitro, by the way. But in early lactation, there is a NEFA response to the immune activation, at least 9 or 12 hours of it. And neither one of them have a ketotic response. So clearly this model doesn't model the transition period ketosis very well. Okay. So metabolism summary is that LPS decreases feed intake and milk yield and increases insulin, but early lactating cows had, despite having a huge immune response, despite having a much more negative consequences to feed intake, they still made milk. And they did this by altering metabolism, energetic metabolism. Okay. So the next thing we wanted to do was, okay, an IV LPS challenge is not very reflective of what happens on farm, of course. So we wanted to create a model that more mimics a natural infection. We wanted to mimic mastitis. So we gave an intramammary LPS challenge, IMM, okay? Excuse me. And this is the paper, if you want more information on it. However, in the interest of time, I will just tell you that every single metric we measured with regards to the mammary LPS infusion was almost identical to the LPS, or IV LPS. In other words, the mammary gland LPS model was almost identical to the IV LPS model. The transition period cow appears much more immune competent than the mid-lactation cow. And just a quick one here to prove a point is that, again, this is that biphasic neutrophilia response. We cause mastitis at time 0. They become neutropenic, and then they have this neutrophilia response that is much more exaggerated in early lactation. Now, this is milk somatic cell on the y-axis. And remember, one of the main reasons we believe that there were transition period immune suppression was because there was a delay in chemotaxis of circulating neutrophils into the mammary gland during mastitis. Well, that didn't occur at all for us. In fact, arguably, there is a meaningful increase in milk somatic cells following intramammary LPS in the early lactation cows. Okay, so this is just a table kind of summarizing all of the things when we compare early lactating cow versus mid-lactation cow LPS model, whether it's IV or intramammary. Essentially everything we looked at from the innate immune system is more engaged in early lactation compared to the mid-lactation cow. Well, what about, we didn't take a look at adaptive immune system. Well, I just recently listened to a nice podcast by Arturo Cangiano. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, a faculty member at Wisconsin, and he had an abstract at this summer's ADSA meetings where he looked at T cell, CD4, CD28, and CD8 receptor abundance, and all of them were increased immediately post-calving. So again, his interpretation, and I would totally agree with him, that this is not supportive of the idea that there's an adaptive immune system suppression. And this also fits nicely with a very recent paper looking at mucosal immune responses. And this was a 2024 paper. Contrary to previous reports of systemic immune suppression, bovine mucosal responses appear to be intact during the immune system. Despite published evidence of decreased systemic immune responsiveness during the same time frame, this data provides support for further research to confirm whether there is an upregulation of mucosal immunity during the peripartum period. Okay, so almost every immune variable that we measured was more robustly engaged in early lactation compared to late lactation cows, albeit we did not look at the acquired immune system, but others are. Despite the exaggerated immune response, early lactating cows continue to prioritize the synthesis of milk. In this, of course, now we have an energetic collision or a conundrum of priorities. This activated immune system that most transition cows have, and the synthesis of milk. So the dominant energetic profile, a footprint of that would be hypoglycemia, high NEFAs, and hyperketonemia. In late lactating cows, the mammary gland gives up. And so you don't get this hyperketonemia, high NEFAs, and hypocalcemia. So I would argue that maybe if it wasn't for the transition period cow having a very robust and engaged immune system, the morbidity would be even worse than it is. And I'm wondering then if that's correct, what are the implications to our dairy nutrition and management strategies? And again, I'm not suggesting that pathogenic inflammation is innocuous. I think that's something we want to limit the peak of it and hasten its resolution. I also think there are a variety of on-farm scenarios that support our interpretation, right? Bovine granulocyte stimulating factor is a fantastic technology. And Dr. Curley and his team did a fantastic job of making us aware of its benefit. That should have markedly improved transition cow health. If there was, in fact, immune suppression, bovine granulocyte stimulating factor should have been a fantastic product. That's the first line of evidence. Transition cows are not as sensitive to high pathogenic avian bird flu. If you are not in the United States, you might not be very familiar, but this bird flu is just ravaging our industry, and right now in particular it's in California. But the very interesting thing about this is that the transition cow is much less likely to experience the negative consequences of bird flu. And of course, I don't think this harmonizes very well with the idea that transition cows are immune suppressed. The other one is transition cows are less sensitive to heat stress. We know heat stress is an immune activating event stemming from a hyper leaky or hyper permeable gut. Well, the transition cows are much less sensitive to heat stress than they are in late lactation. And as we've described recently, NSAIDs sometimes help productivity and oftentimes they don't. So we're trying to figure out if some of this inconsistency in looking at NSAIDs could be due to the fact that some cows are immune, or some cows just aren't simply immune suppressed. So the traditional belief, again, is this, right, with the cow calves. I've already showed you this slide. I think we need to think of this paradigm or this dogma differently, because here, again, you have this immune suppression right in the middle of this schematic. I think we need to look at it differently. What if NEFAs and hyperketonemia are caused by immune activation induced hypophagia at a time when she's trying to make milk, and hypocalcemia is just simply a consequence of immune activation? I think these are symptoms or a reflection of immune activation in the transition period. So here I have it laid out a little differently. We have immune activating events on the top, which we know causes inflammation. And inflammation or immune activation, we know causes hypocalcemia. The mammary gland has TLR4 receptors, so this is the reason why there's an immediate reduction in milk yield. Nothing inhibits feed intake quicker than being sick. I didn't have time to talk about how LPS and inflammation contributes to fatty liver, but the Florida group and Martin Sheldon have done a fantastic job of describing how LPS inflammation causes infertility. In the transition period, the low DMI then caused by immune activation contributes to the DA and to this hyper-NEFA and hyperketonemia response. And of course, there should be another arrow over here going to increase body condition score loss. There's two reasons why a cow is going to have high NEFAs and thus body condition score loss. One is she's milking like a rock star. The other one is she's sick and not eating. So I think there needs to be a shift. It doesn't seem evolutionary advantageous for a female to be immune suppressed after calving. I think these are purposeful changes to help prioritize tissue remodeling and defend to defend against an increased pathogen load. And again, this is all described, I think, in great detail and eloquently in a recent review of ours. I don't think these are markers of immune suppression, I think they're purposeful. They're probably homeoretic to survive an immune response while trying to make milk for her calf. So this is a little figure my two PhD students, Bridget Bull and Galen Combs, made for me. And I think they did a nice job. A healthy animal, you have this immune system represented by this red box. And you have a pathogen load over here by these red, mean-looking dudes. Okay, so now the immune suppression dogma assume that there's an incompetence of the immune system, and the pathogen load essentially stays the same. Well, what if it's different? What if it's not like that? What if in a healthy transition cow, you actually have a robust immune system, but it's just simply that the pathogen load is increased at the mammary gland, the uterus, and the gut. So now, despite the fact that the immune system becomes more exaggerated and robust, the pathogen load of the transition cow is just exceeding its ability to accurately fight it. So I and others don't think the transition cow is necessarily immune suppressed. I think she's just at a greater risk of antigen exposure. And it's this increased exposure that explains increased morbidity, not necessarily a decrease or a immune suppression. Okay, Scott, I think I'm about done. A huge shout out to many of the companies within our industry, the USDA, and my team. This is not a very up-to-date photo. I need to get my current students on there, but I've had a fantastic group of graduate students for 25 years now, and I'm super proud of them. So I think that's it, Scott.
All right.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Baumgard. You're very, very welcome. Before we get started with the Q&A portion of the webinar, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions that you've submitted during today's presentation. The economics of feeding ReAssure precision release choline. ReAssure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow, and yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed ReAssure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your ReAssure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed ReAssure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in ReAssure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it. Payday. All right. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. See, Lance, your first question comes in from Tom. Has leukocyte effectiveness been assessed, contrasted between cows with sterile inflammation versus pathogen-elicited inflammation?
Not that I'm aware of. It's very difficult to distinguish the difference between the two, especially in real time, right? I don't think sterile inflammation causes inappetence or hypophagia or causes cows to go off feed. So that could be one of the criteria that retrospectively a scientist says, okay, they're all inflamed. The one that isn't eating well and milking well is probably the one that has infectious inflammation. The one that's taken off like a rock star probably has sterile inflammation. And it would be interesting, I agree, to look at ex vivo neutrophil function of those two groups. It's a very good suggestion.
All right. Hassan is asking, what is the body condition score located in your scenario?
Hassan's probably asking about the early versus late lactating cow experiments and differences in body condition score.
Yeah.
There were probably some, I don't know off the top of my head, Hassan. that all that information would be in the papers. I just don't, off the top of my head, don't remember what they are. They weren't markedly different.
Yeah. Okay. Juan is asking, my question is about the effect that a negative DCAT has on a tool for prevention of hypocalcemia, and what will it have on the immune status of the transition cow, the impact?
Yeah, great question. Clearly, pre-calving calcium strategies have almost eliminated clinical milk fever, which I think is, probably one of the biggest advancements in dairy nutrition in the last 50 years. And that was, of course, led by Ron Horst and his team. What that has effects on the immune system, I'm not very familiar with, but I think it probably, especially these, I think there's a couple other pre-calving calcium strategies that has additional benefits other than just simply calcium control. And I'm very interested to see if this is also then mediated by the immune system as well.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question by Laura. Is there any immune suppression occurring during pregnancy? And if so, is it possible that allows for pathogen invasion prepartum that is then further enhanced postpartum due to other insults during calving?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, so clearly there's a modification of the mother's immune system so it doesn't reject the growing fetus. And my student, Julie Opgennorth, also was very interested in this idea that then has to switch and turn off following parturition. And could this turning off of this aspect of the immune system be what the trigger? And I don't have a good answer for you, Laura, other than I think it's interesting aspect in another area where we could probably use a lot more information.
Robert's asking, did you measure negative acute phase proteins in the early mid-lactation studies? And could the early lactation cows be more sensitive to the loss in these proteins?
Great question. I knew I should have read those papers again this morning. Yeah, I wish I could remember. Albumin is probably the main one you're talking about, Robert. And we do oftentimes measure that one. I just can't remember if we measured that one or not on these particular experiments. If you email me, for anyone listening, just if you don't have access to the Journal of Dairy Science, email me and I will send you a PDF of those papers. Or maybe I could send them to Balchem and they can provide them with the slides.
Yeah, we can put them. Yeah, we can do that. All right, Dr. Newbold is asking, how does the paradigm shift change your thoughts on her glucose economy?
Well, the glucose, so the activated immune system, of course, requires glucose. And the mammary gland obviously requires lots of glucose. So when the early lactating cow has an immune activating event or has experiencing pathogenic inflammation, now it has this competition of priorities to fuel the immune system and to make milk. And in late lactation, and so let's go back to the early lactation cow. In the early lactation cow, she does that by becoming incredibly insulin resistant. So she mobilizes a lot of adipose tissue. She creates ketones. And now the systemic tissues have access to essentially ancillary fuels that allows glucose then to be partitioned to these two important immune system and the mammary gland. In late lactation, when she has an immune response or pathogenic inflammation, the mammary gland just gives up. And so there's no longer this collision of priorities. So she doesn't need to mobilize adipose tissue and create ketones and become insulin resistant. I'm not sure if I've answered John's question or not, but I think that's why there's this exaggerated immune insulin and glucagon and NEFA and ketone response in early transition cows that are having this pathogenic inflammation.
All right, I got a nutrition question for you that comes in from Al-Zahra. Do you think that specific maternal nutrition during close-up modulates immunity of the in utero calf?
Wow, great question. Well, I guess in large part, I don't really know, other than I think you're thinking of probably maybe specific nutrients, target molecules, rather than just simply being malnourished. For example, we know malnourished mothers and obese mothers. I'm pretty sure there's evidence suggesting that the immune system of their offspring is compromised, or at least different. And the Dutch famine of 1944, whatever that year was, I think is another classic example of that. I don't have great examples other than that.
Okay. Next question comes in from Paolo. Many cows have subclinical hypocalcemia during calving and consequently after. Do you think that hypocalcemia is a real consequence of inflammation, or the opposite, due to low intake?
That's a great question, Paola. I think certainly milk fever is an issue we want to avoid, right? I'm not saying that that's not an issue. What I'm saying is that the subclinical hypocalcemia is probably mostly due to the mammary gland's rapid utilization of circulating calcium and some contribution to this immune system activation. And I'm not sure we want to interfere with that, right? There are the Nina Van Kaiserlink papers and the ones coming out of Cornell now demonstrate nicely that the cows that become hypocalcemic, subclinical hypocalcemic on day 1 of lactation go on to make more milk than cows that don't. So, and if we use milk production as our guide for animal health, which I think remains a very valid approach, but then how bad is acute subclinical hypocalcemia? Now, that prolonged and persistent hypocalcemia that the Cornell group, Jess McArt group is characterizing, I think that's mostly due to immune activation. And I think she has some really nice paper, and Tom Overton has nice data demonstrating or correlating inflammation with these persistent and delayed hypocalcemic cows.
Okay. Next question comes in from Sean. You've talked a lot about inflammation. Are there any markers to focus on practically to measure inflammation on the farm?
Man, not that I know of, not yet. And I'm asked this question a lot, Sean, about we need a biomarker for inflammation. Well, the best biomarker for inflammation, or at least pathogenic inflammation, is milk yield, right? Being sick reduces feed intake and milk. So if you got a cow that's struggling to get onto either one of those two, she's likely sick or has some type of pathogenic inflammation. So she needs your attention, veterinary attention.
All right. This is an interesting question from Elizabeth, and we probably ought to make this one of the last. We're a little bit over time here. Thank you for your patience, Lance. But Elizabeth is asking, many times we treat a cow to solve a symptom, whether that's using NSAIDs to stop milk fever as an example. Does stopping a normal physiological adjustment to a disease such as milk fever do more harm than good, or ruin the cascade of events that should follow? When do we let inflammation ride out, and when do we treat?
That's a great question. And I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, as humans, we're taking NSAIDs all the time, right? We're taking NSAIDs for steroid inflammation, like headache is a steroid inflammation, arthritis is steroid inflammation. But as you mentioned, inflammation is a critically important aspect of the immune response. especially to an antigen or pathogen. So do we want to interfere with that? And I don't know. Maybe the unknown part of the answer is partly reason why there's some inconsistencies in the NSAID literature in the transition period, right? There's a lot of really nice papers demonstrating some benefits, and then there's some that don't. So it's a great question, and I don't think I've answered a question yet, Scott.
Well, I'll give you one shot then. I'll ask the last question. I think you've offered up some great arguments for why we need to reconsider our paradigm on the immune system. And so let's say we buy into that. What's next? Where do we go from a research perspective or even a practical perspective? What do we do with that, Lance?
From a practical perspective, Scott, I think we need to go back to the basics of keeping cows clean. A lot of this, I think, is management. So they're starting off literally at dry off procedures and removing stressors. So stressors being anywhere between overcrowding, especially of the fresh pen or pre-fresh pen, to making sure feed is delivered on time, cleanliness of the calving pen. I think there's a phenomenon in stress physiology called stacked stressors. And I think the transition cow is an absolute perfect model to study stacked stressors. You have dietary changes, right? You have parturition, pen moves, and potentially unhygienic pens, right? And changing their routine. I just think we want to remove as many stressors as possible in the transition period. That's from a practical perspective. Also from the practical perspective, I think in my opinion, we want to minimize knee-jerk reactions to high NEFAs and subclinical hypocalcemia. I think a lot of money is being spent post-calving that might not need to be. From a research perspective, many of the questions that were asked today, I think, would be great research projects, right? Differentiating between the sterile versus pathogenic inflammatory cows. The pregnancy-induced altered immune system and how that shuts off after calving or after parturition, I think would be really interesting. And of course, most of the work is done on the innate immune system. I know others now are just starting to work on the adaptive immune system. I think that has a lot of potential from a research perspective.
Yeah. So Lance has been very, very insightful and entertaining, and I look forward to the follow-up podcast. Put a little plug in there for that. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar as well. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture Series continues with educational topics each and every month, including the next one, which is on February 4th. And that one's titled, Does Beef Cross Dairy Work for Beef or Just for Dairy? And that'll be with Dr. Tara Felix from Penn State University. Visit balchem.com/real science for details on future webinars and to register for upcoming events. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and search for the Real Science Exchange, or visit balchem.com/podcast. And if you want a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt, just subscribe to the Real Science Exchange, leave us a 5-star rating and comment on your Apple app, and send us a screenshot of the comment along with your address to anh.marketing@balchem.com. We'll get that off to you right away. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Baumgard, thank you for joining us today.